A significant severe weather outbreak is in the forecast today across the Midwest. We have a much larger moderate risk of severe weather with multiple strong tornadoes, significant damaging winds upwards of 90 to even 100 miles per hour at times, in addition to very large hail, all being possibilities. So in today's forecast, we're going to break down everything that you need to know about today's severe weather event and what will follow after today into tomorrow. So right now, the Storm Prediction Center has now issued a moderate risk for severe weather. This includes northern Missouri, western Illinois, southwestern Wisconsin, and a large chunk of Iowa, where strong and potentially even a few long-track tornadoes will be a possibility. We have a large enhanced and slight risk, which you should not be disregarding, because these areas will also have a threat for damaging winds, hail, and tornadoes. The only difference with those areas is that the confidence essentially is not as high for severe weather, but you could still see the same threats like strong tornadoes and high damaging winds. That slight risk goes all the way back down into North Texas, and also that enhanced risk includes a large chunk. It includes actually like 8 different states here, like Michigan, Nebraska, and even back over into Kansas. Now, the greatest concern for today will be significant damaging winds, and there could be another derecho this week. We've had 2 already in the last 7 days. We could have a third one today with a significant threat for damaging winds existing in the Midwest, especially in Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And by the way, the average amount of derechos that we have in a given year is usually 2. We could have another one today. So really crazy stuff there. We are going to be live here today on our YouTube channel, so make sure that you are subscribed down below. Significant tornadoes will also be a possibility. We do have a hatched area, which means that strong tornadoes will be a possibility. And what that means is that EF2 plus tornadoes are a possibility today. In addition to that, we have a red shaded area for a large chunk of Iowa, even a sliver of Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri, where there will be an elevated chance for tornadoes in those areas. But again, we have a large area where we could see tornadoes, which goes all the way back over into Missouri, and it includes parts of even western Michigan. An isolated tornado or two will be possible. Our hail risk is also elevated, which includes a large chunk of the Midwest like Iowa and Missouri. With any of those initial discrete supercells, they'll produce an elevated hail risk. We could see hail as large as the size of softballs out of those initial supercells. Eventually, as they move east into areas like Chicago and even into much of Wisconsin, those storms will eventually be tapering down when it comes to the hail risk and transitioning into more of a straight line wind risk with some embedded tornadoes. We even could see some very large hail as far south as areas like Texas, but keep in mind a cap will be in place down here, and I'll explain what that is here in just a moment once we get to that point in the forecast. And then going into Wacky Weather Wednesday, we have another large but narrow and thin corridor for severe weather. This will go anywhere from Texas back into the Northeast, where the main concern is going to be in this enhanced risk, where we are expecting some numerous to widespread thunderstorm activity, which will be producing mainly a hail and wind risk with even a few tornadoes. That'll include areas like Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and even back into a sliver of Tennessee, Kentucky, and even into southern Missouri. That slight risk goes back into the Ohio Valley, which I do think the confidence is going to be lower up that direction for severe weather. But if we do see severe storms, hail, wind, and maybe an isolated tornado will be possible. Here's the hail risk for tomorrow, and this is really the main concern. We'll have a chance for hail upwards of the size of 3.5 to 4 inches in diameter. So make sure you're protecting your vehicle if you're in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, or even in Missouri. You should be doing the same thing anywhere in the brown shaded area, as there will at least be some chance of hail in those areas. Let's talk more about the severe weather setup for today, which I honestly think is very interesting. We have a very strong low-level jet that's going to develop this afternoon. Notice right now, low-level jet not super strong. It's a bit stronger over in central Iowa, but as we go into the afternoon, this is going to become a lot more organized, and we are eventually going to see a negatively tilted trough produce really strong winds in the low levels. Notice the southwesterly flow from Wisconsin back into Missouri and Iowa, and just think of this as fuel for tornadoes essentially. With a low-level jet this strong, we are going to have a very solid chance with any storms that are able to rotate are going to produce the potential for a strong tornado. It's purely due to the fact of how strong the low-level winds are going to be today here across both Wisconsin, western Illinois, and even back into Iowa and Missouri. And as we go into this evening, that low-level jet will really be cranking across Wisconsin and Illinois. But I do want to mention that even though this will be a very strong low-level jet by the time it gets to Wisconsin and Illinois, most of the storms will be linear. Daylight heating will start to wind down, and I think overall the severe weather threat is going to be primarily a wind concern and not nearly as much of a tornado risk. Even though there could still be a couple of tornadoes, it should be a bit of a lower risk over that direction. Here's the low-level jet back over in the Central Plains throughout the morning this morning. Again, notice strong southwesterly westerly flow across a large area. Any storms that are able to develop this afternoon into Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, or even in Texas will be capable of all modes of severe weather. The problem is going to be down here, the cap, and that cap is going to be in place. It's essentially a lid on the atmosphere that prevents storms from bubbling up, and that should be able to prevent most storms from developing back over in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and as well as Texas. But if any are able to develop, we'll be watching for hail, damaging winds, and perhaps a couple of tornadoes. And then back over in Missouri, that low-level jet will remain strong across central and southern Missouri, where there will be a chance again for a couple of tornadoes in that area as well. I honestly would not rule out a strong tornado there either. Another tool that we're going to use for this severe weather setup is the significant tornado parameter, and this essentially gives us an idea of what the environment is capable of when it comes to tornadoes and how high the chance essentially is of tornadoes. So for the rest of this morning, the tornado risk should remain low. It's not zero, but it is going to be a low risk throughout the rest of this morning. It should start to increase though as we go into this afternoon across a corridor in parts of eastern Nebraska near Omaha, back into central and southern Iowa, and back into eastern Kansas and western Missouri. This is where that tornado risk will really ramp up this afternoon with any discrete supercells that develop, which there will be plenty of them developing this afternoon. The thing is that the storms that are going to be discrete will quickly all combine kind of into just a one line as this moves eastbound. So overall, any discrete cells for the next, few hours between about 12 and 4 o'clock will have an elevated tornado risk. But as we go later into the mid to late afternoon and evening, this primarily will become linear. With that said, we could still see some embedded tornadoes with that activity as it moves throughout Iowa, including eastern Iowa and as well as northeast Missouri, and even back into southern Wisconsin. But that tornado risk really drops off quickly after 7 o'clock tonight, where that tornado risk is going to become very minuscule. It'll be just mostly isolated, brief, and weak tornadoes overall in those areas like Michigan or even into central and southern Illinois and as well as Indiana. Now, further to the south, that tornado parameter value area that really has the greatest chance for tornadoes is going to be in this little corridor back over near Joplin, and so areas in southwest Missouri, definitely stay weather aware. I do think the main two areas for tornadoes today will be back over in parts of central and even back into western Iowa, and as well as back over here in parts of southwestern Missouri. I think those will be the two main areas to watch for today for tornadoes. Outside of that, we could easily see tornadoes anywhere else, but those are really the main concentrated areas I think we'll have today when it does come to a tornado risk. One last thing I want to show you before going into the timing is the bulk shear. The reason why I'm showing you this is not to show you rotation in the atmosphere. I'm actually showing you this to give you an idea of how fast these storms are going to be moving today. Once we go into this afternoon, when storms fire up back over in western Iowa and northwestern Missouri and northeast Kansas, the basically bulk shear is showing 75 knots. And what does that exactly mean? Well, if we take 75 knots, translate it to miles per hour, that is somewhere in the ballpark of like 85 to 90 miles per hour. Take that by 75%, and that is going to be your storm speed today with these storms. That essentially means these storms will be racing to the east at upwards of 65 to 75 miles per hour. These are going to be very fast moving storms, so storm chasers, I wish you luck. It is going to be a very fast moving complex of storms today. Regardless of that, obviously these are fast moving storms, so warnings are going to be issued well ahead of time for many areas, or it might feel like that. But these storms, again, really going to race to the east today. They'll slow down just a little bit once they get closer to Michigan, but overall just going to be very fast moving storms today. So for this morning, storms continuing across Iowa. Most of these will be elevated, so the tornado risk should remain low, but it's not zero. The air mass will recover very quickly as we go into the afternoon hours. The first of many discrete cells will fire up in southeast Nebraska once we get closer to 11 and 12 o'clock this morning. And eventually, as we go into the afternoon, this becomes much more apparent that we'll have more discrete and semi-discrete cells firing off in northwestern Missouri and western parts of Iowa. Wouldn't even rule out a couple of storms back over in northeast Iowa. That'll probably be a bit more elevated, but they will produce a threat for damaging winds, hail, and perhaps an isolated tornado or two. Once we get closer to 3 and 4 o'clock, storms are rumbling across central and southern Iowa near Des Moines, and also back into Missouri, where there will be a threat for damaging winds, hail, and again a few tornadoes, which some of those could be strong. And eventually by 5 to 6 o'clock, these storms continue to race to the east at upwards of 60 to 70 miles per hour, producing at this point by around 6 o'clock tonight more of a wind threat. We will still have a couple couple of tornadoes embedded in this line, but I do think the tornado risk really simmers down after 6 to 7 o'clock tonight. And the good news is that daylight heating will wind down after 7 or 8 o'clock, meaning this complex will start to weaken out, mostly with just isolated damaging winds throughout Indiana and eastern Illinois. And the line of storms going over the Great Lakes is dealing with a cold body of water, meaning that a lot of these storms are basically going to stabilize in a sense, meaning that these storms will become a lot less unstable and eventually become much weaker, producing just some gusty winds and then maybe some small hail. Not really much of a tornado risk there. And then we dry out as we go into Wednesday morning, which will lead to our next threat of severe weather as we go into Wednesday. For those back over in the central and southern plains, storms will be firing up right around probably about 2 or 3 o'clock this afternoon across this line of storms. Really anywhere in western and southwestern Missouri is another area that I would be watching for very closely. I do think the main concern here will be damaging winds and hail, but we also could get the potential for a couple of tornadoes and maybe even an isolated strong tornado. By 6 to 7 o'clock, these continue across central and southern Missouri. By around 8 to 9 o'clock tonight, they continue to move south and east, and by 10 to 11, they're moving into Arkansas, where there will be some hail, wind, and then maybe an isolated tornado. And again, that'll eventually lead to another threat of severe weather as we do go into Wednesday. Good news is that Wednesday's setup is not going to be the same as what we are going to see today. It's actually going to be a lot weaker in nature. The low-level jet, which is what we're showing here, is much stronger in the Midwest today, and that's just natural with a negatively tilted trough. We are going to have a much more potent environment today and a much more unstable environment for tornadoes, damaging winds, and hail. By tomorrow, and this is right around the peak of daylight heating, notice there's really not much of a low-level jet anywhere where we're going to be seeing severe weather aside from Canada, where we actually could get some severe weather here in Canada. But back further to the south, back in like the Ohio Valley and the southern plains, there won't be much of a low-level jet. With that said, we will at least have a chance for a couple of tornadoes back down in Texas, even though I think the threat will be low. It's definitely not zero. And then also back over in the Ohio Valley, same thing goes there. So definitely not a super potent environment for tomorrow. Now, in terms of the timing for tomorrow, storms will weaken as we go into Wednesday morning. I do think the environment tomorrow in the Ohio Valley is going to be a big hit or miss. We're either going to see storms or we're not, and there's a very solid chance that we don't really get much here other than maybe just a couple of isolated hailstorms, maybe some outflow driven storms back over in like southern Indiana and southern Illinois. The air mass might not recover quick enough, and there might just not be enough instability there for severe weather in general. But if we do see severe storms, they'll be during the late afternoon into the evening hours there. Further to the south, though, a much higher confidence exists for severe weather, including lots of storms. Tomorrow morning, storms will be ongoing in Oklahoma with hail, wind, and maybe an isolated brief tornado. Those should be relatively elevated. By after lunchtime, we'll have storms developing in North Texas, back into Arkansas, where there will be plenty of shots here for large hail, damaging winds, and a couple of tornadoes. Once we go into the late afternoon and evening, those continue to move east into Arkansas and northern Louisiana. I do plan on being live tomorrow as well, so make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. Like the video as well if you did enjoy this video.